Thank you so much, brother, for joining me. And welcome to another episode of Living Abroad, the podcast. And again, thank you. I know how busy you are. Thank you so much for making time for talking to me.
You're welcome, Pablo. Welcome, welcome.
Yes, as I mentioned to you, I started this podcast. It's called Living Abroad. I try and celebrate, raise awareness, and to people who have like come, not from this country, and they come here and make things happen for themselves.
Mhm.
It's easy to make excuses, and so I try and bring in people who are doing things for themselves in this country, despite anything. So you're one of those people.
I see what you have to ask me is.
Are you nervous?
No, not really. No, I've done this a few times, so I'm a bit of a seasoned veteran on podcasting now. But you talked to me about this about maybe 3 years ago. I'd not done that before, but in the last 3 years, I'm so podcasty now. So,
Can you introduce yourself to people who'll be watching this and not know who you are?
all right. My name is Graham Campbell. I'm well, I suppose a Scottish Anglo-Jamaican, and I was born in London, raised in a Caribbean family. I consider myself to be Jamaican.
Mhm.
I have been in Scotland now for 24 years. So I've been in Glasgow for most of that time. I did originally come to Edinburgh back in 1994. Stayed for a couple of summers between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Liked it, but I was planning to go to Jamaica. I was planning to just go relocate permanently from London to there,
Mhm.
and Scotland got in the way, really. So I didn't plan to be here this long, but I went to Strathclyde University, did a course.
Mhm.
I did some community activism. So today I'm a Glasgow City Councillor, and I've been a Glasgow City Councillor for 7 years, representing the Springburn Rob Royston ward. In my second term, I'm the
Mhm.
first African Caribbean person to be elected to Glasgow City Council. I'm the first one to do 2 terms, and I think
Wow.
I'm the first to be the convener of an education committee. Now, I'm convener of the Glasgow Education Committee, which deals with, schools, nurseries,
Mhm.
primary schools, and we set the policy and the budgets and all that sort of stuff. So I've been the
Wow.
chair of that now since 2022. I'm
Mhm.
also chair of the council's Slavery and Colonial Legacy Working Group, which I helped set up in 2021
Mhm.
following the Black Lives Matter protests. And we decided to try and start the process of decolonizing our
Mhm.
legacy of slavery, but to address it in the
Yes.
history and the stuff. So we commissioned reports, and my committee has been gingerly trying to push the council towards doing something about the street signage and, you know,
Mhm.
we tell the story. So those are the two main things I'm probably best known for. Started as a community
Wow.
activist, and
Mm.
I've always been community active. And back in 1984, when I was growing up,
Wow.
I was, fighting against racism in my community, in my daily
Mm.
life. I took part in the miners' strike. If people don't know about the history of Britain in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, that was a very important year between
Mhm.
1984 and 1985. Essentially, Britain had a class struggle civil war, and
Mhm.
the rich won because the
Yeah.
miners lost.
Mhm.
But lots of us from across the working class, we supported the miners' strike, and for a
Mhm.
year, they heroically stood against Margaret Thatcher's tyranny. And,
Oh my goodness.
and
Wow,
we
you've been on this for a long, long, long time. Activism and
absolutely.
politics.
But it also should say, that as a South African, this will be important to you. I come from Islington, which is important in
Uh-huh.
anti-apartheid, of course, because it was where the anti-apartheid movement was based. It's where Oliver Tambo lived when he was in exile in London, and it's
Oh,
where the ANC basically ran its organization and the International Anti-Apartheid Movement from. So I knew lots of
wow.
exiles, the
Uh-huh.
ANC, the PAC, Azapo. I knew all of them when I was a student in London in the 80s. So I had a very good grasp of what was going on.
You were born in London, and I moved to Scotland around 2010. And at the time, I mean, we had our own community. When I arrived here, there was already like a community of African people. It wasn't that bad, and there was no. I think the whole mass like deportation has come down. If you can paint a picture of how Scotland was 10 years ago, I mean, you when you arrived here like 24 years ago.
Okay, it's fair to say that Scotland has always had African students here, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly from West Africa, from
Mm-hmm.
Ghana and Nigeria,
Mm-hmm.
long-standing uh, student-based organizations. They were just still around. The Ghana Welfare Union's been around for 50 years. Well, it was clearly a less diverse and more white place, I suppose you have to say. But it's not true to say that it didn't have any African and Caribbean people. It's always had some, and most of them were students at the universities, mainly Glasgow, obviously. But there were African students' organizations like the Ghana Welfare Association, which is still around today,
Mm-hmm.
founded about 1972. There's always been a West African student presence here, so Nigerians as well. The Igbo
Mm-hmm.
Youth, also about 50 years old as well.
Mm-hmm.
From about African Caribbeans, though, have always been relatively low in numbers. So most of the black people here have been directly from Africa. But Scotland's always had obviously Asian population, a Chinese population from Hong Kong mainly, and an African, West African,
Mm-hmm.
but very small numbers of Caribbean people. So, and I'm told that back in the 1970s, when the city centre of Glasgow was redeveloped, and what's now the Brummy um,
Mm-hmm.
hotels along that drag, there used to be lots of African and Caribbean people living there. And when the 60s and 70s came to an end and Glasgow's industrial times came to an end, that black community that lived there,
Mm-hmm.
and it mostly went to Manchester, Birmingham, and London. So a lot of the Scottish Caribbean people were kind of left at that point. So when I arrived, was it 2002, I suppose, I came to Sight Hill. And Sight Hill was one of the places where refugees from Congo, from Kosovo, Iraq, and so on, Kurdistan, that's where they were basically told to live. The Home Office forcibly sent people in a program called dispersal, and it was basically to stop people going to London and staying there and sent to other cities. Now they were sent with some resources. I mean, it was under Tony Blair, so the city council got a contract to house these people, but with some money to support them with social services, education, and so on. At first,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't spend that money very well, but they put them in the worst possible housing conditions in the city in these tower blocks, and that was where the available housing was. And that's where I went because when I moved to Glasgow, that's where I got a flat. And I happened to come there with my London experience of working with black tenants and council tenants fighting for their rights and anti-racist
Mm-hmm.
campaigns and so on. And I had the right mix of skills really to be in that particular place because Sighthill in them days, there was a big struggle around poverty and inequality for that community that was already there. But also they weren't used the indigenous white population there weren't really used to these other cultures, and they got used to it fairly quickly. But there was a little bit of a racist backlash, and so there was a sort of time between 2000 and 2005, I'd say, where we were strongly doing two things: a, fighting racism on the ground and trying
Mm-hmm.
to community organizing, and then basically unifying the two main communities around the thing that was most important to them, and that was housing. So fighting for housing, good housing conditions, housing rights, and so on. We united the refugee groups with the local people, and the
Mm-hmm.
parents talked to each other at the school gates. We did a lot of community engaging and unifying. And by the time we finished, and I was chair of the Tenants Association there, and I learned a lot of things from that. The way to defeat racism was to get people to see the human being, get them to fight jointly for things that they had in common and see the refugees' point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And most importantly, was to get the refugees' own self-organization respected. That's the other thing. Nothing about you, about you. These
Mm-hmm.
respect us as an organized people. So we got the Afghans, Kurdish people, African Congolese, everybody to work together in the same organizations. And a lot of people you now see in the voluntary sector in Glasgow today had their time in communities like Sight Hill, Torry Glen,
Mm-hmm.
Scots, so on. They built community organizations from those days. So many of our African-led groups probably have their origins in this struggle to keep the refugee community here. So that I arrived when this struggle was going on, and we won.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, there was a big struggle. But if in terms of South Africans, I knew South Africans right then. There were nurses coming here, doctors, technicians, and so on coming to work in the health service and the home care, and they were experiencing some serious problems, with racism and inequality and so on. So right from the
Yeah.
beginning, I was involved in that. So
So is it like, I mean, would you say it's planned, like how, like where to place certain people?
it wasn't thought out. I think what it was is that because the pressures in, the immigration issue is always toxic, especially the asylum issue is always toxic as well. And back then, Tony Blair conceded to that racist sentiment in the mainstream press by, oh, well, we'll ship them out of London to the other cities. So big cities like Glasgow, Manchester, and so on
Mm,
were asked to host people, and they were given a little bit of money at first. And that situation happened for about 10 years. So for 10 years, they paid for the relocation costs. They
mm,
paid gave them a little extra money towards the social services and education costs, and with the aim of settling people. But you had to have somewhere to
mm,
live, and the only available housing was the housing that the Glaswegians generally were boycotting, didn't want anymore. People didn't like living in
mm,
flats for whatever reason, usually because they haven't been upkept and maintained properly since they were built, pretty much. So all these buildings were built in the 60s and 70s, and by the
mm.
90s they were in poor condition. And when you're living in a 20-story tower block, and some of them are
Yeah,
down. So we were forced to live in some of the worst conditions in the city. So we thought that wasn't right, and the people who already lived there thought that wasn't right too. So that gave us a
yeah.
basis to together, and that's what saved us. I think it was the struggle to fight for our rights as tenants that helped us to forge bonds across. And I think that was true in
Mm.
all the areas where we were sent to live. But that was we went to those places because that's where the housing was.
Well, and I mean, for you, I mean, you've been doing this like campaigning activism like for a long time. What is it about you? Where do you get this energy that you're like, okay, this is not right, but I'm gonna raise my hand up and actually do something about it? You can easily just look on like the rest of us and be like, that's not right, but I don't know where to start. Where did it start from for
Okay.
you?
My dad is from Jamaica, and
Mm,
he's post office professional for all his life. So he started as a postman, worked his way up, became a manager, retired in the early 90s. He lived in Tottenham in North London all his life, and he was a friend of Bernie Grant. If you know Bernie Grant, he was one of the first black MPs in 1987. He used to run Haringey Council, which is where Tottenham is, in North London. And he was quite an influential left-wing Labour politician who was one of the leaders of the reparations movement at the time. So
mhm,
he very strong character. He died a few years back, but Dad was one of his colleagues in the post office unit. My mum came from an island called Grenada, a small island, and they met and formed a partnership. But
mm,
we kind of grew up in the I grew up in the 70s when uh, British society, particularly London, was much more racially segregated, was much less accepting of a black British identity, whatever it was.
mm,
We were still seen as foreign, So I when I went to school, I experienced racism on a daily basis. The far right party of the day was called the National Front, and it was openly fascist, wanted to send all the black people home. Its ideological inspiration was a guy called Enoch Powell, who's also the ideological inspiration for Nigel Farage's politics. So these
mm. I
guys
was
were
going to ask you about him later on, but yes.
Enoch Powell. So he was a very evil racist former conservative minister in the 60s, and he made a speech called the Rivers of Blood speech, which is essentially in 1968 when he basically said to white racist people, look, watch out, the black people are coming and they'll soon be a majority. Essentially, that's what his speech meant. He was
Mm,
claiming that people were racially attacking white people when it actually was the other way around.
mm,
The experience we had was all the stuff in that speech. If you read that speech, you're always saying, oh, well, people put excrement through your letterboxes. That was happening to families I knew. People were being attacked on the way to school and to and from their home. We had to fight back. One thing that I
mm,
learned from that period of time is to defend yourself. And Jamaicans had a kind of reputation from my dad's time
mm.
of fighting back. People were kind of scared of Jamaicans because they knew they wouldn't take any nonsense. So I was brought up with that. You fight back,
Mm,
and that's really, and you fight for your rights. You always stand up for your rights. So I was very
mm,
strongly influenced by the climate of the time, which was fighting against racism and fighting for our right to be there. Be
mm,
very clear that I'm an African Jamaican and I might not be British, but I have a right to be there because Britain was where it was in my country.
mm.
Like,
Yeah,
and
you
I
had that.
So I had a very strong consciousness, and also in the 70s and 80s, African liberation wars were going on. The anti-apartheid struggle was a big important thing for us.
Yeah,
So
it was really hard at that time not to get involved and not to see what's happening. And
yeah, so
also
that's
now, yeah, if I mean when you move to Scotland, why SNP out of all the parties?
okay. Well, I started. Well, I would say I'm still a revolutionary social democrat. I'm still a socialist. So that's how I would describe my politics. I don't believe in the Russian system of socialism or the Chinese system of socialism. I believe in a democratic bottom-up version of socialism,
Mm,
popular revolution. So I've always believed that, but I've also fought for independence of oppressed countries or marginalized countries in Africa
mm,
and wherever else. And the logic I've found in this country, having been here, is that it is clearly a different country. It's one of these odd countries that is both a perpetrator nation, but it's also a subordinated nation.
victim, yeah.
But it's a victim and an oppressor. It's both,
Mm,
because Scotland's big in the empire, and
mm,
I've got a Scottish name because Scots were involved in the empire in Jamaica and the Caribbean.
mm,
But from what I've seen of the country and the spirit of Scottish people, they suffered a thing during the post-war period, from the
mm,
50s, 60s. They suffered a period of deep deindustrialization and destruction of their society, essentially, especially in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher, who experimented with all sorts of things. The
mm,
poll, big thing here, what's now the council tax, very deeply unfair tax. It was pioneered in Scotland in 1987 in the teeth
mm,
of opposition, and it led to a rebellion, which led to a socialist party being formed. And that Scottish Socialist Party, I came and joined it, and I was a representative of that.
mm,
But I've always supported independence, and one of the things I think that struck me was just how different in mindset Scots were, and it was partly because they'd experienced this migrant thing. Many Scots I knew had lived in London or Manchester or Birmingham, and they'd seen what racism was like. And often, when you was in London, you met people on your council estate. You would meet people who'd come down from Scotland to get a job. They'd had to be migrant workers in London. Some of them had to do
mm,
the same sort of dirty jobs that you did.
mm.
Uh, my dad, when he first came to London to get a job in the post office, the two groups of people he would be lining up with to go and get a job were Scots and Irish migrant workers. So
Yeah.
there's some affinity between it because they all had that same experience that we'd had, and
Mm.
not being treated as English, being discriminated against. So they had a degree of understanding of that. And then by the time I got
And
here, there were
empathy
lots of
towards
people who
immigrants.
had been away and then had come
Mm,
back to Scotland and were delighted with the idea that it should be more multicultural and diverse. So there was lots of people with that attitude. So I was really pleasantly surprised at how many people had that approach to it. They wanted people to come here, and they
mm,
were with the changes because Glasgow really suffered with the deindustrialization. So it's transformation into this sort of cultural place where you do music gigs and you do cultural
yeah.
events, hotels and tourism. So it's all changed in how the whole city operates ever since the 90s. And that's been an important thing. So we've arrived at a time of transformation, and
Mm,
we've been able to make some contribution to make it a much more international place. And I think lots of Scots people like that. So that's something that's attracted me to the place. And
mm,
that's really probably what's made me stay. I was very welcomed in Sighthill, and I've never
mm.
been with neighbours, although the flats are not there anymore. Lots of my neighbours have moved to the area around which I now represent. So lots of my
Yeah.
vote have ended up voting for me because they knew me from that struggle. And that's been really pleasant, to be able
Yeah,
to.
and when you mention that, I mean, I talked to a lot of people that came here like in the early 2000s, and they talk about arriving in London and being like transported to Scotland at some point. And, was it Scotland that was inviting immigrants, or was it London saying, have them? What was that? Why were people moved?
Yes, it was a policy by the Home Office essentially it was forced relocation, but for the refugees. But actually, it was the cities wanted people to come partly because in Glasgow it helped to arrest a decline in population, a decline in working age population, and a decline in school rolls. I mean, had Sighthill carried on with the population that it had in the late 90s and didn't have an influx of refugees, I'm quite sure that the schools that they had there would have closed because there would have been a declining population. If I remember rightly, I think that school was, the one that's now
Mm,
campus. that school would have been closed. And we were
Wow.
lucky that because refugees came and their children came, those schools stayed open and those teachers stayed employed. And also,
Wow.
it drove up the educational attainment of the whole city because kids were coming who wanted to be at school, and it had a really good impact. Guess what? I'll
Mm-hmm.
get working class white Scottish children. It helped drive up their attainment as well. So we
Wow.
had such a positive impact on that level. And also, obviously, that the community was a bit more economically vibrant and diverse, all the skills that were coming to it. Sighthill went from a pretty much, you know, over 50% unemployed community to a mostly employed community during the time I lived there. So
Mm.
uh, it transformed itself because the community was a bit different and more diverse, international. And we did a lot of really good community things, which are still getting a positive legacy from now. And I'm sure that's true of all the other communities that happened to.
Yeah, this is a narrative that is not shown on social media when, like, you see people say, oh, these immigrants, they need to go back and this and that, they're taking all our jobs. What you just said there, like, Scotland did need immigration.
Yes, and and it was welcomed. I mean, in the sense that the one lucky thing we had about Scotland at the time is that it was cross-party agreed between the SNP, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats,
That we do need these people.
and we agreed between us across the spectrum that we needed more people to come. We should welcome refugees, and the
Mm,
city, that was its policy. So it was a welcoming policy from city and Scottish government level, brought about by an unwelcoming policy from the UK government. But it ended
mm,
up with us receiving this bounty of good, skilled people and their
mhm.
children, and their career paths, and all of that to influence our society. So it's changed Glasgow so much for the better, made it a
Yeah.
more place. And I'm sure that's true of all the rest of the towns around Scotland as well, who've had an arrival as well. So it's
Mm,
really important for Scotland and Glasgow's sort of sense of itself, who it is. Now, today, I think it's nearly a quarter of the children who are in our primary schools and secondary schools are from an ethnic minority background, right?
yes.
One in four people are not white Scottish. So
Mm,
big, that's a big deal. The Douglas Murray's and people like him as this culture war attack on supposedly the war of civilizations. Well,
mhm,
as I think it was Zhou Enlai, the Chinese revolutionary leader, he once said when asked, "What do you think of British civilization or Western civilization?" He said, "I think it would be a very good idea."
mm,
Meaning, he didn't think they were very civilized at all. And this is the kind of nonsense you get from politicians like that. But I'm very straightforward about this. The biggest victims of supposed Islamic terror in the world are actually Muslims.
mm,
Muslims are the ones who've been most affected by that problem. So the idea that we are the biggest problem, victims of it is real nonsense. The people who are here, who live here, who are Muslims, want the things that we value in this society, which is freedom, democracy, freedom of expression,
mhm.
women's rights, all of those things that they're here for, they get because they're here.
No, but
They're
the idea, yeah, the idea is that, we're coming over here and all of a sudden whites are gonna be extinct in few years if they're not watching out. With the appointment of Hamza, it's kind of like, you see what I'm talking about now, they're gonna be, before you know it, well, Rishi Sunak as well. It's like before we know it, they're taking over.
freaking out, weren't they? There was this moment when you had Rishi Sunak in Downing Street, Vaughan Gething, the leader of Wales, you had Leo Varadkar leading Republic of Ireland, and you had Hamza.
Hamza, yes, it's like, you
You
see.
had four of them meeting at the same time. So they must have really freaked out with that one. Black and brown. Oh my goodness. So yes, this is the thing, isn't it? If you are shallow and racist and you see only the skin color rather than the ideology represented by the person talking to you, then okay, you will find that a problem. But obviously, it's nonsense. I mean, despite the
Yeah.
fact that Rishi Sunak was brown, he presided over a very racist immigration policy, a very racist discriminatory asylum policy.
Mhm.
He was a brown face for white power. That's why that woman carried a placard saying coconut on him. He was brown on white on the inside, meaning he was a racist. And that's still the case. He still is a racist, and because of the politics he represents, not because of his skin color.
Mhm.
you know.
When you say Rishi Sunak is a coconut and this, how hard is it as, like as a person of color when you are in parliament and in power? And us, we're just normal people. We expect you to be a magician, get there and change things overnight for us. Otherwise, you're going to be called names. For you as a leader that had to represent people on the ground, and now you are sitting there, how hard is it to change things from the inside? Because I mean, I just expect you to give me a passport now if I come to you and say,
Okay. Well, I have lots of friends who are in the voluntary and social enterprise sector from the African communities, and their big beef with the council and republic bodies is that
mm,
they're just simply not taking race equality seriously enough. We have a lot of statistics in Scotland which show the discriminatory patterns of behaviour of the society generally, and the discrimination in employment and the treatment, everything from black maternal health care
mhm,
to employment rates, underemployment of people who are university qualified, in non-recognition, all of the issues that we all know about and talk
mm,
about. We have really great statistics. What we don't have is great implementation of
mhm,
the changes you require to do something about it. That removing barriers to employment and so on. But we've lived through a period of 15 years of austerity
mm,
since 2010 when Cameron's government was in. And so the resources to do anything about some of these things have just not been there. So that's been the
mm,
biggest challenge being a politician the last 7 years, living through a time when you don't have the resources to do the thing that you're
mm,
charged to do properly. So the expectation is that you can remove these barriers. One of them is housing, and obviously one of the issues that families have is overcrowding in the house they currently have. If they have more than two children, it's really difficult to get a council house or a
mm,
housing association house because nobody's building those. They demolished most of them because they
mm,
used to be in the high-rise flats that we all used. But because those have gone, the supply of large-sized family houses. So that's an institutional discrimination that's happening because we're not building enough family-sized housing to replace what we lost when we demolished those high-rise. And
mm,
my battle has always been as a housing activist to start getting those built again. And I've made a difference because I know because I've banged on about it in the
mm.
committees I've been on. Housing now. So I actually have to say, well, how many large-sized family units are? Because that's a discrimination against
Yeah.
minority communities. I'm able to say that because I'm in the position of power. Because I'm in the position of power, I am able to change the curriculum around racism. I am able to instill an anti-racist ethos in each school. I am able to make sure more black teachers are employed, which I've done. More black people are being employed by the council than ever before. I've put in specific change to make that happen. So I know of my record. I've practiced what I preach. The
Mm,
difficulty is when you are the black within a power structure is changing that power structure. It's very, very difficult.
mm,
You will meet a lot of resistance. And of course, your community's expectation is rightfully, understandably
mm,
high because the discrimination to end. You want the opportunities for your children. You want the structure to treat you correctly. And so
mhm.
you're constantly protesting about how the structure treats you, especially with social work and so on, and how education
Yes.
happens if you have at school. I've dealt with dozens of cases of these, and it's involved, because I've been in that power situation, I've been able to get people their kids back. I've been able to get them placed in schools. I've been able to
Mm,
get programs in place to stop children being racially bullied and harassed. So I've made a difference. I know I've done that, but
mm,
it shouldn't have required me to be in power to do that. It should have been normal. The system
mm.
defended our rights. And that's the difficulty. Unless we're collectively organized in some way in community associations, in
Mm.
grassroots groups, we are not, I think we're not politically active enough. As an African and Caribbean community, we're not politically active enough to
Yes.
make our weight. Not
Mm,
enough of us are run for office, and I've done a lot of work to try and get more of us to run for office. But it's not simply having a black face. People have to have black mindset and politics when they arrive there. And
mm,
lots of people who are in the positions don't have a mindset which is pan-Africanist in approach, or with a sense of, yeah, it's not just Nigerians I care about. It's actually all of the Africans I care about. It's not just Africans
mm,
I care about. I care about what happens to uh, Chinese and African and white people. I care about those things. And people have to trust you as their representative to fight for their rights regardless. And I
mm,
do my bit to make sure that the community knows that I will fight for their rights for justice on whatever level it is. And I think because I've had this track record as an activist, and also because in office I've done my best to use my power where I can,
Mm,
people can see that I do make a difference. I wish I had more colleagues, though. I have to say, I wish I had more colleagues who cared about the stuff we've been talking about today. Because,
mm,
black mental health, for example, that injustice. QISA, the Kenyan Women's Association, are doing some events coming up in the next few weeks. They're doing some really great work,
mm.
putting statistics out there, analysing it, and putting a report out there that people will see that they've got an event in Edinburgh coming. That's
Yeah.
really important work. Draw attention to black women's lives and what's happening to you, because but unless you've got the political power to make the government and the councils and the health boards do something about that, and this
Mm,
is my lesson. It, you have experiences that are not good, especially around policing. God, policing, the
mm,
Sheku Buhari. I spent 10 years. It will be 10 years in May that since Sheku Buhari was killed by the police in Kirkcaldy. You know, quite honestly, our community has not been as active in supporting the family's fight for justice as it
mhm.
should have been. It should have been hundreds and thousands of black people outside the inquiry in Edinburgh standing with that family
How
and
can we
emotion.
mobilize? Yes, I mean, that was going to be my next question. How do you get Black people care enough? And like I asked you, like it takes a certain like a special person to raise their hand and say, I'll lead. How do you motivate Africans, Caribbeans, like people, the minority, to kind of like care?
I think they do care. I think it's not a problem of caring. It's a matter of do they have time in their busy lives? When they're dealing with family, they're dealing with the jobs they might have to do which are antisocial hours, and maybe they have to work longer to pay for everything that they have to do to get their visa.
Mhm.
But there's also the fact that if you go to church or mosque, which 90% of us do, some of your life is devoted to worship and to the community of the church. So the spare time that you have to be political active is very small. So the answer is that political activists have to go to where the black community already is. We have to get in and amongst the churches and the mosques to the
Mm.
imams and the pastors. We have to do our political
In
activism
don't forget the care
there.
homes.
We have to learn some of, yes, but all the places where we work.
Yes.
In health. And so I work with the black healthcare workers in the NHS, and I've done a lot of work with them over the years, particularly
Mm.
nurses, to fight against discrimination in employment for them. I
Yeah.
still support their work in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We need to have a lot of self-organization across everywhere.
Mm.
We have to just get organized and
Oh
do
my
our
God.
bit.
Yeah, and oh my God, we only have like less than a minute left, and we should do this again. We haven't like even started, and I feel like the time just flew away. Please promise me you'll come back again. I know you're busy.
Absolutely. Oh, don't worry, I'll make time. I will make time.
And lastly, like the last minute that is left, what are you most proud of, as the Black community and with your job and the work that you've done for the Black community? What are you most proud of? Just 10 seconds.
I'm proud of the fact that Glasgow University and the Glasgow City Council apologised to the African Caribbean community for slavery, and I was helped to push that motion through in 2021. That I'm proud of the fact that we have a course in reparatory justice, meaning reparations for slavery, at Glasgow University with the University of West Indies that we started, and that started last year. So the first cohorts graduated just there in January. I'm really proud of the fact that that has happened. That has happened partly because of my involvement, but
Thank
partly
you.
because of other activists who made that happen from the Dominican community. Very proud of that, and I'm glad that Glasgow's put itself on the map to do that.
Thank you so much. We will see you again. I can't thank you enough.